Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Oppenheimer Security Hearings. First thing I'm going to do today is just quickly test my audio and make sure that everything's working all right on the stream side of things, and then we'll get started. So yeah, just give me 1 second for that. Okay, testing the audio here. Just want to, and then we'll get started. So, okay. Audio looks good to me. So, hello everyone. I hope you're having a great weekend. I'm doing well. And today I'm excited to talk about more Oppenheimer. We are now on day 4 of the hearings. It is Thursday, uh, Thursday, April 15th, 1954. And the Oppenheimer hearings are just continuing. If you remember, yesterday was cross-examination by Roger Robb of Oppenheimer directly, and that was pretty crazy. There were a lot of moments of what seemed like entrapment, to the point where even Gordon Gray, the commissioner, had to sort of say, "Oh, we're not trying to do any entrapment here," even though it was pretty clear that they were, like in essence, maybe unintentionally or intentionally, who knows. But today we're going to have a new witness, and that's going to be Leslie Groves, who's played by Matt Damon in the movie. He is the general that Oppenheimer works under during the Manhattan Project, so that'll be cool. Also today, I did some research and I wanted to read a little bit from a book that I found about the isotopes hearing that that created animosity between Oppenheimer and Strauss, and what led to this hearing essentially was Strauss's scheming after Oppenheimer basically screwed him over. So I actually found the original transcripts from the Joint Committee of Atomic Energy, where I'll talk about that more later, but it's cool. So before we get started, just want to say, if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave them in the live chat and I will answer them pretty quickly. I check the chat every 10-ish minutes. And then also, if you have any questions for me and you're watching this back later in the week or later in the months or years to come, feel free to just leave them in the comments and I will answer. So yeah, let's just get started. So today I'm going to read a bit from a book called Robert Oppenheimer, A Life Inside the Center by Ray Monk, published in 2013, which I was able to find in my school library. I put the title on the whiteboard here, finding some use for the whiteboard, but it's not very clear with the glare and stuff, so I put it on screen there too, if you're interested in reading this book. So it is a very long book. It's like 650 pages. So the section I want to read is around page 560. So let me just get to that. I did not bring a bookmark with me. Well, I did bring a bookmark with me, but I brought it for a different book because it's inside a different book that I'm actually reading right now, called Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. I am about a third of the way through the book, and I can't just take out the bookmark or else I will lose my place in that. So yeah, it's a pretty good book so far. Anyway, so now let's just get into this. So this is page 558 of this book right here, and I'm just going to read from it for a little bit. So, by the end of June 1949, then leaked FBI documents had severely weakened the esteem in which Oppenheimer was held by his fellow scientists, had wrecked the careers of several of his ex-students, and had all but destroyed the closest and most important emotional relationship of his life, that with his brother. In the same month, Oppenheimer himself took a major step toward his own ruin when he made an implacable enemy of a man who, on more than one account, was in a position to do him great harm. That man was Louis Strauss, who was both a member of the AEC and a trustee of the Institute for Advanced Study. Within a few years, he would be chairman of both the AEC and the Institute's Board of Trustees. He was a vain man who craved above all admiration and respect. Oppenheimer felt neither admiration nor respect for Strauss and made no secret of it. 2 years earlier, Strauss had felt slighted by Oppenheimer when Oppenheimer gave evidence to the AEC concerning the possible military uses of radioactive isotopes. Such isotopes were a byproduct of the nuclear reactors at, for example, Oak Ridge and Hanford, which fell under the administration of the AEC, and it had been U.S. policy to allow the isotopes to be sent abroad to friendly countries to be used in scientific research. In the spring of 1947, Strauss attempted to reverse that policy on the grounds that the isotopes might be used for military purposes. When asked for his opinion on the matter, Oppenheimer simply dismissed Strauss's concerns as not worthy of serious attention, and, much to his chagrin, Strauss found himself outvoted on the issue by 4-1. So yes, this is the isotopes issue. And as you'll see, there's going to be a quotation here from a congressional hearing. Oppenheimer basically publicly humiliated Strauss, and Strauss did not get over that. So yeah, continuing. Now in June 1949, Strauss, who had never accepted that he was wrong about the possible military application of isotopes, had another chance to reverse the policy. This time, the occasion was not a closed session of a small committee in an out-of-the-way office, but a full congressional hearing, with cameras and reporters present, held in the huge caucus room of the Senate. The hearing was before the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which had been set up in 1946 to oversee the AEC and had the power, if necessary, to veto AEC decisions. In 1949, the chairman of the Joint Committee was Brian McMahon, who had become an enthusiastic advocate of the policy of building huge stockpiles of atomic bombs. Also on the committee was the right-wing Republican Senator Bork Hickenlooper, who had a fierce distrust of the AEC and of Oppenheimer in particular. The general purpose of the hearings now underway was to investigate Hickenlooper's allegations that the AEC was guilty of incredible mismanagement. Strauss, whose political views were in general close to Hickenlooper's, had succeeded in enlisting the senator as an ally in his campaign to stop the export of radioactive isotopes, the practice of which was now examined as an example of the alleged mismanagement of the AEC. On June 9, Strauss had testified before the Joint Committee that isotopes might indeed have some military value, and that therefore he was against their export. Hickenlooper agreed. When the U.S. provided other nations with isotopes, he said, it was embarking on a program inimical to our national defense. So Strauss testifies on June 9th to this committee, and I actually have document this set of hearings basically went for the entire month of June. It was a long hearing and like a series of hearings, and I found the transcript. So the general title of this investigation was called Investigation into the United States Atomic Energy Project. And this went for the month of June 1949. Strauss testified over 2 days on June 8th and June 9th. And then Oppenheimer testified a few days later on June 13th. And here he rebuked Strauss's testimony. This was the context in which Oppenheimer gave his very public and subsequently heavily reported demolition of Strauss's opinion. Oppenheimer himself, of course, was not without vanity, especially about his legendary ability to make fools of others. Jeremy Bernstein remembers that at physics seminars at the Institute, Oppenheimer, quote, sat in the front row, and if he made what he thought was a witty comment, he would look around to make sure that we had all taken it in, end quote. He liked an audience, and this hearing provided him with a large and attentive one. The specific issue at hand was whether the US should, as they had been requested, provide Norway with an isotope of iron, iron 59, to use in the monitoring of the manufacture of molten steel. So I'm not exactly sure what that is in the monitoring of the manufacture of molten steel. My guess would be that would be to track where the steel ends up. That's a common thing. I mean, not that common because it requires radioactive isotopes, which are very expensive. But when you want to track something, you can put some radioactive elements on there, and then you know that it is the item that you tracked. I think famously, or not famously, but I think this has been used in the past to like track drug money and like mafia money. Now, I'm going to admit, I saw that in a Batman movie. Okay, I think that was The Dark Knight Rises, uh, the second one with the Joker, where at the beginning of the movie, they are trying to find like where all the mafia money's going, and so they have these uh, dollars that have been doped with like radioactive material, and so they wipe a Geiger counter over it, and they're like, oh look, these are the dollars that we you know sold in like some sting operation, and they're here in this bank, so this is a mafia bank. Um, Now, I'm pretty sure they do that in real life too, but unfortunately, the only example I know of is from a Batman movie. But anyway, so I imagine they're doing the same thing with steel for some reason. Norway wanted to do this. But anyway, continuing. Strauss had discovered that one of the members of the Norwegian research team was a communist, which in his eyes and Hickenlooper's made all the more pressing the question of whether Iron 59 could have any conceivable military use. When called upon as a witness, Oppenheimer made it clear that his purpose was not only to refute Strauss's view, but to subject it to lacerating ridicule. Quote, "No one," he said, "can force me to say that you cannot use these isotopes for atomic energy. You can use a shovel for atomic energy. In fact, you do. You can use a bottle of beer for atomic energy. In fact, you do. But to get some perspective, the fact is that during the war and after the war, these materials have played no significant part, and in my knowledge, no part at all." End quote. As Philip Stern, who was there at the time, has noted, quote, "Even to an observer who had no background on the issues and personalities involved, it was clear that Oppenheimer was making a fool of someone." End quote. The AEC lawyer, Joe Volpe, was sitting next to Oppenheimer, and looking over to where Strauss was sitting, saw Strauss's eyes narrowing, his jaws working, and color rising in his face. From that point on, he said he kept, quote, "one eye on Oppenheimer and the committee, and one eye on Strauss," end quote. Rubbing salt into the wound, Oppenheimer continued, "My own rating of the importance of isotopes in this broad sense is that they are far less important than electronic devices, but far more important than, let us say, vitamins, somewhere in between." The official record of the meeting records at this point, quote, "laughter." When Oppenheimer stepped down, he said to Volpe, "Well, Joe, how did I do?" "Too well, Robert," Volpe replied, "much too well." Years later, David Lilienthal, recalling the sight of Strauss at the end of Oppenheimer's testimony, remarked, "There was a look of hatred there that you don't see very often in a man's face." End quote. And so then it starts to talk about a cover of Oppenheimer's appearance in the magazine Life. But yeah, so very intense right there. And I have the transcript, the full like transcript of both Strauss's testimony on June 8th and 9th and of Oppenheimer's testimony on the 13th, where that quote right there comes from. And that quote is also used in the movie, the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, where that quote of like, "You can use a bottle of beer in the development of atomic weapons. In fact, you do," which is, I mean, it is a pretty comical and true statement, which is that in such a complex uh, undertaking as the atomic bomb, uh, you use a lot of things, and a lot of those things are normal things, like shovels or a bottle of beer. But obviously, the concern of Strauss and others was that, oh, these isotopes could be, are like instrumental to the development of a bomb, which I don't believe is true. Definitely certain isotopes. I think I sort of skimmed through some of Oppenheimer's testimony to that Senate committee. Uh, some isotopes of, say, plutonium are definitely very, very useful to building an atomic bomb. And he said, like, oh, we wouldn't want to export those, but iron 59 has kind of no relation, or is like very low on the set of things that you need to build an atomic bomb. And since Norway is an ally, it's like we might as well just give it to them. So yeah, definitely just interesting stuff. And this is the source of the animosity that Strauss had for Oppenheimer. So when Strauss became the chairman of the AEC, he, pushed for this security hearing to happen against Oppenheimer. So that's a little context for you about these hearings. But that's all I have to say. So let's get started with the hearing transcripts proper. Okay. The above entitled matter came on for hearing pursuant to recess before the board at 9:30 a.m. The presentation will begin. I believe that General Groves is waiting. General Groves, I should like to ask whether you would like to testify under oath. You are not required to do so. Okay, so now we have General Groves in here. Let me reorder the slides a little bit just to bring him up here. Okay, so we got General Groves, and let me pull up the hearing here. So he is going to be on the witness stand today. Oppenheimer is off to the side, watching as like a spectator, because he has, the right to do that since he's the one that's on trial here, essentially. So yeah, so he's just off to the side watching. Okay. Okay. So yeah, Mr. Gray said you can testify under oath, but you don't have to. General Groves says, whichever you prefer, it makes no difference to me. It is my guess that most everyone who appears will be testifying under oath. It makes no difference in my testimony, but I would be very glad to. What are your initials? Leslie R. Will you raise your right hand? Do you, Leslie R. Groves, swear that the testimony you are about to give the board shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Whereupon Leslie R. Groves was called as a witness and, having been first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. So we have direct examination by Mr. Garrison. General Groves, you are now Vice President in charge of Advanced Scientific Research at Remington Rand. No, I am not. I am no longer in charge of research. I am a Vice President and Director of Remington Rand. During the war, you headed the Manhattan Project in complete charge and development, planning for use of the atomic bomb. That is correct. During the post-war period, here, wait, sorry, one sec, I just want to check that the stream is still doing okay. Okay, just give me one moment. Okay. Okay, so I think we should be good. I just get paranoid about that sometimes. I'm like, is something wrong? Okay, sorry. So I will continue now. Okay. During the post-war period, you were Commanding General of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, 1947 to 1948? Yes, my charge of the atomic work ended on the 1st of January 1947. I think you also should add that during the period from about March of 1947 until my retirement on the 29th of February 1948, I was a member of the Military Liaison Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. You appointed Dr. Oppenheimer to be the director of the work at Los Alamos. Yes, sir. You developed a great you devolved great responsibility upon him. Yes. Would you just say a word about the nature of that responsibility? Complete responsibility for the operation of Los Alamos Laboratory, the mission of which was to carry on the research necessary to develop the design of a bomb, to develop the probabilities of whether a bomb was possible and if the design would be feasible, and to develop what the power of the bomb would be. That was so that we would know at what altitude the bomb should be exploded. General, may I interrupt? I'm sorry. If it becomes necessary in the course of your testimony to refer to any restricted data, I would appreciate your letting me know in advance that you are about to do so. All right, sir. Not only design and make these experimental tests, but to actually produce the bombs which we expected to use in the war. It should be understood that as early, certainly before Yalta, because at that time I was so informed President Roosevelt, or just before Yalta, I had concluded that we only needed 2 bombs to end the war. Of course, I also proceeded on the theory that I might be wrong. For that reason, I decided, that we would construct the actual bombs at Los Alamos. That included, as matters developed, the final purification of plutonium at Los Alamos. Possibly, I am not certain, any final purification of U-235 that might be necessary. In addition to that, as time went on throughout the project, I consulted with Dr. Oppenheimer frequently as to other problems with which I was faced. I think one of those is of such importance that it might be well to explain it, to give a picture of the responsibilities which you might say he carried. There was a very serious problem as to the purification of U-235. While this is not secret in any way, I would rather not have it talked about by anyone here because it reflects to some extent on the wisdom of another scientist. There are no security implications involved. No security whatsoever. I will watch out for that. I have been watching out for that for so many years, I don't think I will slip. Thank you, sir. There was a great question as to the electromagnetic process. How pure did the U-235 have to be to have an explosion? We could get no advice on that matter from the people that were responsible because nobody knew. All that was known was that the natural state of 0.707% of U-235 in uranium that it did not explode. Various people, particularly those vitally concerned with the electromagnetic process, felt that a percentage of somewhere around 20% to 14% would be explosive. They were greatly influenced by the fact that they thought that their process, as they had developed, would produce material of that purity. I felt that was not sound, and that we would have to have a much higher percentage of purity in order to have an explosive. Dr. Oppenheimer was used by me as my advisor on that, not to tell me what to do, but to confirm my opinion. I think it is important for an understanding of the situation as it existed during the war to realize that when I made scientific decisions, in case there are any questions that come in on that outside of not knowing all the theories of nuclear physics, which I did not, nobody else knew anything either. They had lots of theories, but they didn't know anything. We didn't know whether plutonium was a gas, solid, or electric. We didn't even know that plutonium existed, although Seaborg, I believe it was, claimed to have seen evidences of it in the cyclotron. We didn't know that any of the constants that were so vital We didn't know what any of the constants that were so vital were. We didn't know whether it could be made to explode. We didn't know what the reproductive factor was for plutonium or uranium-235. We were groping entirely in the dark. That is the reason that General Nichols and myself were able, I think, to make intelligent scientific decisions, because we knew just as much as everybody else. We came up through the kindergarten with them. While they could put elaborate equations on the board, which we might not be able to follow in their entirety, when it came to what was so and what was probably so, we knew just about as much as they did. So when I say that we were responsible for the scientific decisions, I'm not saying that we were extremely able nuclear physicists, because actually we were not. We were what might be termed thoroughly practical nuclear physicists. As a result of this experience, maybe because Dr. Oppenheimer agreed with me and particularly because of other questions that were raised, I came to depend upon him tremendously for scientific advice on the rest of the project, although I made no effort to break down my compartmentalization. As you know, compartmentalization of information was my chief guard against information passing. It was something that I insisted on to the limit of my capacity. It was something that everybody was trying to break down within the project. I did not bring Dr. Oppenheimer into the whole project, but that was not only because of security of information, not him in particular, but all the other scientific leaders, men like Lawrence and Compton, were treated the same way, but it was also done because if I brought them into the whole project, they would never do their own job. There was just too much of scientific interest, and they would just be frittering from one thing to another. So Dr. Oppenheimer was used in many ways as a chief scientific advisor on many problems that were properly within his bailiwick. That included his final advice, which brought up the question of the thermodiffusion separation process, which was the case, as you know, probably by now, that we made this last-ditch effort to bring that into the project. We were late in bringing it in because, again, this is something that is not confidential, but I would rather not have it talked about. There had not been the proper cooperation by certain scientific personnel at the Naval Research Laboratory. There had been suspicion on the part of certain scientists that the figures that were talked about at the Naval Research Laboratory were not sound, and to put it bluntly, that they were just plain faked, and we could not depend on them. The reason they felt this way was that the results were not in accord with scientific theory. It just gave the wrong answer. They were too favorable. We did not get into using that, to my recollection. I'm not absolutely certain. But I believe it was Dr. Oppenheimer who suddenly told me that we had a terrible scientific blunder. I think he was right. It is one of the things that I regret the most in the whole course of the operation. We had failed to consider this as a portion of the process as a whole. In other words, we considered this process as a process that would take uranium-235 from 0.707 up to the final purity, instead of saying we will take it from 0.707 up to, say, 2% and then put that in. What we had done, everybody in the project, this was brought to my attention by, I believe, Oppenheimer, had failed to think about, well, after all, if you started off with uranium at 2% instead of 0.7 in any of our other processes, we would be crippling our output. I tell you that not in praise of Dr. Oppenheimer, but more to give you a picture of how he was used throughout the process. I think that more or less answers Mr. Garrison's question. If I talk too long, Mr. Gray, if you will, just tell me to stop. It is your time and not mine. How would you rate the quality of his achievement as you look back on it? Naturally, I'm prejudiced because I selected him for the job, but I think he did a magnificent job as far as the war effort was concerned. In other words, while he was under my control, and you must remember that he left my control shortly after the war was over. If you had to make the decision again, would you make it the same way with respect to the selection of Dr. Oppenheimer and devolving the responsibilities on him which you did? I know of no reason why not. Assuming all the conditions are the same, I think I would do it. You saw him very closely during those years. I saw him on the average, I would say, of anywhere from once a week to once a month. I talked to him on the phone about anywhere from 4 to 5 times a day to once in 3 or 4 days. I talked on all possible subjects of all varieties. During the time I spent a number of days, for example, on trains traveling where we might be together for 6 or 8 or 12 hours at a time. You were aware of his left-wing associations at the time, his earlier left-wing associations. Was I, or am I? Were you at the time you appointed him? At the time I appointed him to the project, I was aware that there were suspicions about him, nothing like what were contained, and I might say I read the New York Times, the letter of General Nichols to Dr. Oppenheimer's letter. I was not aware of all the things that were brought out in General Nichols' letter at the time of the appointment, but I was aware that he was, or what he had, you might say, or that he had, you might say, a very extreme liberal background. I was also aware of another thing that I think must be mentioned, that he was already in the project, that he had been in charge of this particular type of work, that is, the bomb computations, and that he knew all that there was to know about that. In general, my policy was to consider the fact that the man was already in the project, and that made it very questionable whether I should separate him, and also whether I should separate him under what might be termed unpleasant conditions, because then you never know what you are going to do to him. Are you going to drive him over to the other side or not? As far as what I knew at the time of his actual selection, I knew enough to tell me that I would have considered him an extreme liberal with a very liberal background. Just how many of the details I knew at the time, I don't know. I did know them all later. Based on your total acquaintance with him and your experience with him and your knowledge of him, would you say that in your opinion he would ever consciously commit a disloyal act? I would be amazed if he did. Was there any leakage of information from Los Alamos to improper sources for which Dr. Oppenheimer had, in your opinion, any responsibility? That is a very difficult question, because it brings up the fact that the scientists, and I would like to say the academic scientists, were not in sympathy with compartmentalization. They were not in sympathy with the security requirements. They felt that they were unreasonable. I never held this against them because I knew that their whole lives from the time they entered college, almost, had been based on the dissemination of knowledge. Here, to be put in a strange environment where the requirement was not dissemination, but not talking about it, was a terrible upset. They were constantly under pressure from their fellows in every direction to break down compartmentalization. While I was always on the other side of the fence, I was never surprised when one of them broke the rules. For example, I got through talking to Niels Bohr on the train going to Los Alamos for the first time. I think I talked to him about 12 hours straight on what he was not to say, certain things that he was not to talk about out there. He got out there, and within 5 minutes after his arrival, he was saying everything he promised me he wouldn't say. The same thing happened on one occasion with Ernest Lawrence. After he was told that he was not to say something, he got up to the blackboard with this group, it was a group of smaller size than this of the key people, and said, "I know General Groves doesn't want me to say this, but," and then he went on and discussed what I didn't want him to say. That's funny. I think that's directly portrayed in the movie. He gets up there and then starts talking about what General Groves doesn't want him to say. Anyway, you may say, what kind of military organization was that? I can tell you I didn't operate a military organization. It was impossible to have one. While I may have dominated the situation in general, I didn't have my own way in a lot of things. So when I say that Dr. Oppenheimer did not always keep the faith with respect to the strict interpretation of the security rules, if I could say that he was no worse than any of my other leading scientists, I think that would be a fair statement. It would not be right to say that he observed my security rules to the letter, because while I have no evidence of his violating them, after all, I am not stupid, I know he did. I could not say of my own knowledge that I ever knew him just on the spur of the moment, and I can't recall a case where he deliberately violated my security instructions. That is different from violating what he knew that I would want. That was done by everybody in my organization, including the military officers, because my organization was a peculiar one. A great deal of responsibility devolved on everybody. They all knew the goal. I know I was put in positions where I had to approve things people knew I didn't want to approve, but they got me in that corner. That was not limited, as I say, to scientific personnel. It applied to engineering personnel. That applied to military officers. They were the kind of men I wanted, and they were the kind of men that made the project a success. If I had a group of yes men, we never would have gotten anywhere. The absence of compartmentalization on the Los Alamos project, General Groves, would you say that represented on Dr. Oppenheimer's part an honest judgment as to what, in his opinion, would produce the best operating results among the scientists on the project? I always felt, I can't quite answer that Dr. Oppenheimer was led to that breakdown of compartmentalization at Los Alamos by a number of conflicting factors. Here I'm just giving my surmise as to what I thought. First, that he personally felt that was right in view of his background of academic work. Second, that he felt it was necessary in order to attract the kind of men that he felt he had to have at Los Alamos. I agreed that it was a very decided factor and always thought it was in getting such men. I also felt that he was very much influenced at that time by the influence of Dr. Condon, who was for a brief time the associate director there, and as you all know, a very complete disappointment to me in every respect. I would like to emphasize now, before any question is asked, that I was not responsible for the exact selection of Dr. Condon, but I was responsible for his selection because I insisted when Dr. Oppenheimer took the directorship that he have as his number one assistant an industrial scientist, and we just made a mistake when we selected Dr. Condon. Who gave his name the first time, I don't know, but Dr. Condon turned out to be not an industrial scientist, but an academic scientist with all of the faults and none of the virtues. That was my opinion. He did a tremendous amount of damage at Los Alamos in the initial setup. How much influence he had on Dr. Oppenheimer, I don't know, but he was given certain responsibilities with my full approval, in fact, you might say my every insistent suggestion, that Dr. Condon, with the industrial background, should be the one to establish the working rules and the administrative scientific rules in the establishment, while Dr. Oppenheimer was thinking about how the actual scientific work to be done. How was the actual scientific work to be done? Oh, cool. We have a comment from CDP. He says, awesome contribution you're doing at Graviton Media. Thank you, CDP. I'm glad that you enjoy it. I'm having a lot of fun doing it as well. I'm learning a lot about Oppenheimer and history stuff, and yeah, I like doing this every week, so thanks. Anyway, continuing there. I could never make up my own mind as to whether Dr. Oppenheimer was the one who was primarily at fault in breaking up the compartmentalization or whether it was Dr. Condon. I don't to this day know whether it was wise. I think it was a serious mistake and felt so at the time to have the lack of compartmentalization go on down the line. In other words, it was all right to have the leaders, maybe 20 to 30, but not to have as many men as were permitted to break down compartmentalization. The Greenglass and Rosenberg case, which I always felt the effects were greatly exaggerated, that the Russians did not get too much information out of it. That case, according to the testimony of this sergeant, would never have been possible if the junior scientific personnel at Los Alamos had observed the rules and regulations. They all, of course, had given an oath that they would support the security regulations, but that was not controlling. They wavered here and there. I think that answers your question in general. How long was Dr. Condon on the project? I think a very short time. The record would show, but my impression would be only 6 weeks to 2 months. I don't recall. A very short time. His departure, of course, was at his own volition. I always thought it was because he thought the project would fail, and he was not going to be associated with it. His record showed since then he has never been satisfied anywhere he was. He was always moving. It was a mistake to get him out there. It is a mistake for which the responsibility was maybe 75% mine and 25% Oppenheimer's, or maybe my share was even more than that. But mine was very heavy, because he would never have been out there if I had not told Oppenheimer what kind of assistant he should have. Apart from the question of compartmentalization as an operating policy, you had no occasion to believe that any leakage of information from Los Alamos occurred as a result of any conscious act of Dr. Oppenheimer's. Oh no, I don't consider that his compartmentalization was a conscious act that would tend to encourage the leak of information. You had complete confidence in his integrity. During the operation of Los Alamos, yes, which was where I really knew him. And you have that confidence today? As far as that operation went, yes. As I say, as far as the rest of it goes, I am, you might say, not a witness. I am really ignorant on that, excepting what I read in the papers. As the war neared its end, there was an even greater urgency to produce the bomb in time to use it, was there not? No, because no one in this country conceived of the Japanese War ending as soon as it did. No one in responsible positions today, no matter what they say today or said since. There is not a soul that thought that the war was going to end within a reasonable time. Did Dr. Oppenheimer work as hard as a man could to produce that bomb in accordance with the deadline dates that you had projected? Oh, yes, yes. In fact, he worked harder at times than I wanted him to, because I was afraid he would break down under it. That was always a danger in our project. I think it is important to realize in the case of Dr. Oppenheimer, because I had a physical taken of him when we were talking about making it a militarized affair, and I knew his past physical record, and I was always disturbed about his working too hard, but I never could slow him down in any way. One second. Do you recall your conversation with him about the Chevalier incident? Yes, but I have seen so many versions of it. I don't think I was confused before, but I am certainly starting to become confused today. I recall what I consider the essential history of that affair. As to whether this occurred this time, where I was at the moment, I can't say that I recall it exactly. I think I recall everything that is of vital interest as far as would be necessary to draw a conclusion as to that affair. Will you say what your conclusion was? My conclusion was that there was an approach made, that Dr. Oppenheimer knew of this approach, that at some point he was involved in that the approach was made to him. I don't mean involved in the sense that he gave anything. I mean he just knew about it personally from the fact that he was in the chain, and that he didn't report it in its entirety as he should have done. When I learned about it, and throughout, that he was always under the influence of what I termed the typical American schoolboy attitude that there is something wicked about telling on a friend. I was never certain as to just what he was telling me. I did know this, that he was doing what he thought was essential, which was to disclose to me the dangers of this particular attempt to enter the project, namely, it was concerned with the situation out there near Berkeley. I think it was the Shell laboratory at which Eltaton was supposedly one of the key members. And that was a source of danger to the project, and that was the worry. I always had the very definite impression that Dr. Oppenheimer wanted to protect his friends of long standing, possibly his brother. It was always my impression that he wanted to protect his brother, and that his brother might be involved in having been in this chain, and that his brother didn't behave quite as he should have. Or, if he did, he didn't even want to have the finger of suspicion pointed at his brother, because he always felt a natural loyalty to him, and had a protective attitude toward him. I felt at the time that what Oppenheimer was trying to tell me and tell our project once he disclosed this thing at all, as I recall, I had the feeling that he didn't disclose it immediately. In other words, he didn't come around the next day or that night and say to our security people, listen, some things are going on. I think he thought it over for some time. I'm saying what I thought now and not what we could prove, because we could never prove anything definite on this thing, because it all depended on the testimony of a man who was concerned in it. I always felt he was trying to protect his brother, and possibly in any case to protect Chevalier, or to protect somebody else who was a friend, whom he felt that the man had made a mistake, and he had adequately taken care of that mistake and more or less warned this man off. I felt that was wrong. If I had not felt it was important not to have any point of issue on what, after all, was a minor point with respect to the success of the project, I might have had quite an issue with him right then and there. As he told me very early in my conversation with him, he said, "General, if you order me to tell you this, I will tell you." I said, "No, I am not going to order you." About 2 months later, or some time later, after much discussion in trying to lead him into it, and having then got the situation more or less adjusted, I told him, "If you don't tell me, I'm going to have to order you to do it." Then I got what to me was the final story. I think he made a great mistake in that. I felt so at the time. I didn't think it was great from the standpoint of the project, because I felt that I was getting what I wanted to know, which, after all, I did know already, that this group was a source of danger to us. I didn't know what this group had tried to make I didn't know that this group had tried to make this direct approach and pinpoint it that way, but I knew they were thoroughly capable of it, and I knew we had sources of danger in the Berkeley project. I think that really was my impression of it, that he didn't do what he should have done. The reasons why were the reasons why were desire to protect friends and possibly his brother, and that he felt that he had done what was necessary in pinpointing. As far as I was concerned, while I didn't like it, after all, it was not my job to like everything my subordinates did, or anybody in the project did, I felt I had gotten what I needed to get out of that, and I was not going to make an issue of it, because I thought it might impair his usefulness on the project. I think that gives you the general story. I think that is all that I would like to ask. Mr. Robb? All right, now it's cross-examination time. So let's move things around. Okay. Cross-examination by Mr. Robb. General, you said this group. What group did you have in mind, sir? The group at Berkeley? Oh no, the group at the Shell Oil Company laboratories. We never knew how many people were in that group. I didn't bring it to the attention of the Shell Oil Company at the time because I didn't want to disclose anything. I would rather have it there where I knew it. Of course, after the war, I brought it to the attention of various friends in the Shell Oil Company, and I believe that group was cleaned out in 24 hours. General, I find in the files a letter signed by you dated November 14, 1946. I will read it. Okay, address. Dear Mr. Lilienthal, I desire to bring to your attention that in the past I have considered it in the best interest of the United States to clear certain individuals for work on the Manhattan Project, despite evidence indicating considerable doubt as to their character, associations, and absolute loyalty. Such individuals are generally persons whose particular scientific or technical knowledge was vital to the accomplishment of the Manhattan Project mission. In some instances, lack of time prevented our completely investigating certain persons prior to their working for the Manhattan Project, so that in some cases individuals on whom it was subsequently determined that derogatory information existed had access to project information. With the appointment of the Commission and the legal provisions for investigation of personnel by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I see no reason why those persons on whom derogatory information exists cannot be eliminated. I unhesitatingly recommend that you give the most careful consideration to this problem. The FBI is cognizant of all individuals now employed on the Manhattan Project on whom derogatory information exists. Sincerely yours, Leslie R. Groves, Major General, USA. I find an answer to that from Mr. Lilienthal, dated December 4, 1946, which I will read. Dear General Groves, This will acknowledge your letter of November 14, 1946 concerning continued employment of project personnel whose character, associations, and loyalty have been questioned by the Manhattan Project, but who have been employed nevertheless because they were considered vital to the accomplishment of the Manhattan Project mission. This matter will receive the most careful consideration by the Commission. It would appear that since the persons referred to in your letter had been continued somewhat beyond the accomplishment of the Manhattan Project mission, that you do not regard their presence as a source of critical hazard. On the other hand, if in your opinion a decision in this connection is urgent, I would appreciate your further views. Sincerely yours, signed David Lilienthal, Chairman. I find then your response to that letter, dated December 19, 1946. Dear Mr. Lilienthal, reference is made to your letter of December 4, 1946, concerning the presence of certain individuals in the Manhattan Project whose character, associates, and loyalty may be open to question. They could not be discharged summarily, but as I explained, their removal is of necessity a rather slow process, and whenever possible, such removals have been effected by us through administrative means when the individuals could be conveniently relieved of such assignments. Considerable progress in reducing the number of such individuals has been made to date. It would seem to me that with the re-investigation of all Manhattan Project personnel by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you could find it appropriate to effect the removal of the remaining individuals of questionable character. Sincerely yours, signed Leslie Groves, Major General, USA. So that's interesting, but it definitely makes sense, which is that during World War II, uh, the U.S. didn't trust Russia. They didn't trust them, but they were allies, allies of convenience sort of thing, where you're only allies because you have a common enemy. And you know that once that common enemy has been taken care of, that you'll be at each other's throats, which obviously ended up happening during the Cold War. So it made sense that during World War II, when the US is kind of desperate to defeat the Nazis, they would just say, okay, screw it, we're just going to hire whoever we can, even if we think they might be communists, even if they might be a bit sympathetic to the Russians, a bit too sympathetic for our liking. We're going to do it because we have to do it because we have no other choice. But once the war's over, and it's like, okay, we've dealt with the Nazis, we've dealt with Japan, now they begin to say, okay, well, now our ally of convenience is our enemy. So Russia, no longer an ally, now it's our enemy, and so we're going to have to reconsider everyone who was on the project because that is more urgent a matter now. And so, yeah, that sort of rationale, that sort of thinking and process makes sense that that would start to happen after the war. So, yeah, okay. General, do you recall writing the two letters and getting the answer from Mr. Lilienthal? I recall writing a letter. You did very well. I didn't recall the other two. I recall writing one. I think it is appropriate, if I may, to insert that these letters were only written because previous verbal discussions, which were very limited, had proven unavailing, and because Mr. Lilienthal had made it very plain that he wanted no advice of any kind from me. He wanted nothing whatsoever to do with me. He thought that I was the lowest kind of human being, and he was not going to get anything from me. This was written because I felt that it was the only way that I could adequately bring to the attention of the Commission the seriousness of this problem. Knowing government procedure, I knew that as long as it was verbal, nothing would be done. If I put it in writing, that they would always be thinking about the record. That is the reason that the letter was written. I have never made a practice of trying to protect myself on the record, but I thought this was one time that I could secure action, and it was not written really with the idea of clearing my skirts for something that might come up, such as this, many years hence. It was to make him do it, whether he wanted to do it or not. That's also kind of funny too, because that's a bit of a familiar experience of like talking to someone about something and then just realizing, okay, you got to get it written in records that they'll actually do something. But but yeah, okay. So okay. General, was Dr. Oppenheimer one of the certain individuals to whom you referred in those letters? I don't believe so, because Dr. Oppenheimer was really out of the project at the time. Of course, he was retained as a consultant, but just what my consultant arrangements with him were, I'm not certain. It was more of a personal affair. I would say that he was not one of those that I was thinking about. I recall who I was thinking about in particular, and he was not the man. I don't think I was thinking about him. If I may answer that, you may ask next, but which is necessary for my answer. If he had been a member of the Manhattan Project at the time, he would have been one of those about whom I was thinking. General, would you have cleared Dr. Oppenheimer in 1943 if you had not believed him to be essential to the project and if you had not known that he was already steeped in the project? I think that I would not have cleared him if I had not felt that he was essential, and if he had not already been so thoroughly steeped in the project. If the two were separated, I don't know. I can't say, because I was never faced with that, and it is awfully hard to try to recast it. I will show you a photostat of a letter bearing your signature, dated 20 July 1943, and ask if that is the letter whereby you did give clearance to Dr. Oppenheimer. It is certainly my signature, because nobody has been able to forge it yet, and they have tried many times. Nobody could ever do it. I don't remember the exact wording. I do know that a letter of this general tenor was written, where there is no question but what it was my letter. There is no question but that it was my letter, I think. Again, there's typos in this transcript that haven't been corrected. Anyway, I might read this into the record if it is stamped top secret, but it has been declassified. Subject: Julius Robert Oppenheimer. To the District Engineer of the Manhattan Project. 1. In accordance with my verbal directions of 15 July, it is desired that clearance be issued for the employment of Julius Robert Oppenheimer without delay, irrespective of the information which you have concerning Mr. Oppenheimer. He is absolutely essential to the project. Signed, Leslie Groves, Brigadier General, blah, blah, blah. Okay. General, did your security officers on the project advise against the clearance of Dr. Oppenheimer? Oh, I am sure that they did. I don't recall exactly. They certainly were not in favor of his clearance. I think a truer picture is to say that they reported that they could not and would not clear him. General, you were in the Army actively for how many years? I don't know, 1916 to 1948, and of course raised in it also. And you rose to the rank of Lieutenant General. That's right. During your entire Army career, I assume you were dealing with matters of security. Never before this thing started. We didn't deal with matters of security in the Army really until this time. The Army as a whole didn't deal with matters of security until after the atomic bomb burst on the world, because it was the first time that the Army really knew that there was such a thing, if you want to be perfectly frank about it. Certainly with your work in the Manhattan Project, you dealt intensively with matters of security. I would say I devoted about 5% of my time to security problems. You did become thoroughly familiar with security matters. In fact, oh wait, I think that I was very familiar with security matters. In fact, it could be said that you became something of an expert in it. I'm afraid that is correct. I believe you said that you became pretty familiar with the file of Dr. Oppenheimer. I think I was thoroughly familiar with everything that was reported about Dr. Oppenheimer, and that included, as it did on every other matter of importance, personally reading the original evidence if there was any original evidence. In other words, I would read the reports of the interviews with people. In other words, I was not reading the conclusion of any security officer. The reason for that was that in this project there were so many things that the security officers would not know the significance of that I felt I had to do it myself. Of course, I have been criticized for doing all those things myself and not having a staff of any kind, but after all, it did work and I did live through it. General, in the light of your experience with security matters, and in the light of your knowledge of the file pertaining to Dr. Oppenheimer, would you clear Dr. Oppenheimer today? I think before answering that, I would like to give my interpretation of what the Atomic Energy Act requires. I have it, but I never can find it as to just what it says. Maybe I can find it this time. Would you like me to show it? I know it is very deeply concealed in the thing. Do you... Oh. Do you have the same copy? I have the original act. It is on page 14, I think, where you will find it, General. You have the same pamphlet I have. Thank you. That is it. The clause to which I am referring is this. It is the last paragraph of BI on page 14. It says, quote, "The Commission shall have determined that permitting such person to have access to restricted data will not endanger the common defense or security," end quote. And it mentions that the investigation should include the character, associations, and loyalty. My interpretation of endanger, and I think it is important for me to make that if I am going to answer your question, is that it is a reasonable presumption that there might be a danger, not a remote possibility or a tortured interpretation of maybe there might be something, but that there is something that might do. Whether you say that is 5% or 10% or something like that, of that order, does not make any difference. It is not a case of proving that the man is a danger. It is a case of thinking, well, he might be a danger, and it is perfectly logical to presume that he would be, and that there is no consideration whatever to be given to any of his past performances or his general usefulness, or, you might say, the imperative usefulness. I don't care how important the man is, if there is any possibility other than a tortured one that his associations or his loyalty or his character might endanger. In this case, I refer particularly to associations and not to the associations as they exist today, but the past record of the associations. I would not clear Dr. Oppenheimer today if I were a member of the Commission on the basis of this interpretation. If the interpretation is different, then I would have to stand on my interpretation of it. Thank you, General. That is all. I would like to ask a question, General Groves. This relates to a question Mr. Garrison asked about the urgencies, whether the urgencies had been stepped up, with respect to having these weapons ready towards the end of the war. My recollection is that you said that there was not any acceleration as far as you are concerned? No. My mission, as given to me by Secretary Stimson, was to produce this at the earliest possible date, so as to bring the war to a conclusion. That was further emphasized by his statement that any time that a single day could be saved, I should save that day. The instructions to the project were that any individual on the project who felt that the ultimate completion, insofar as he understood it, was going to be delayed by as much as a day by something that was happening, it was his duty to report it directly to me by telephone, skipping all channels of every kind. So that urgency was on us right from the start. And any instructions with respect to that which went to the laboratory at Los Alamos would have come from you? That is correct. I think for your information, while the laboratory officially was under General Nichols, because the whole district was under Nichols by an understanding between Nichols and myself, because that left me doing nothing but telling Nichols what to do, and it was beyond his capacity to do everything in general, a division of direct responsibility was made, and Nichols took over essentially Oak Ridge and the general administration. With respect to Los Alamos, it was directly my responsibility, in every way, everything that happened. The orders were issued direct. We tried to keep Nichols informed to such extent as was necessary, so from a practical standpoint, although not on paper, the chain of command was direct from me to Dr. Oppenheimer. One other question now. Do you recall any key personnel in the project who left the project because of unsatisfactory record or promise as security risks? Oh, yes. There were some that were gotten rid of. A man named Hiskey, who very unfortunately happened to be a reserve officer and was called to active duty and thus gotten out of it. A man named Lomnitz's deferment on the draft was taken away. He was eventually drafted, although that took the utmost pressure. His draft board refused to remove the deferment. It became a matter of issue in which General Hershey had to issue direct orders that this exemption be removed and that he be drafted. If he was not drafted, he was going to get rid of the entire state board as well as the local board, which apparently was controlled by an element that were not in accord with what you and I think they should be. The board insisted on this man's being deferred. There were other people that we wished to get rid of that we were unable to get rid of because of the effect upon the organization as a whole. Those were men, I don't think their names need to be mentioned, about whom I had suspicions. Also, I think bearing on this, there was an early conversation with the Secretary of War's office at the time before I started dealing with the Secretary direct, in which I asked if it was possible to intern a particular foreign scientist, an alien, and I was asked what evidence I had, and my reply was that I had no evidence other than intuition. I just didn't trust him. I knew he was a detriment to the project. I didn't accuse him of disloyalty or treason, but simply that he was a disrupting force, and the best way out of it was to intern him. I was told that this man didn't want to take it up with the secretary. I insisted on it. He came back and said, "General, the secretary said we can't do that. General Groves ought to know that." I told the secretary. Of course, General Groves knew would that would be your answer. He just still wanted to make a try. I think that is essential to realize. In other cases, one of them at Berkeley, where I asked Dr. Lawrence or told him that I wanted a man to be gotten rid of, he said, "If I get rid of him, don't misunderstand me. If you order it, I always accept your orders. I want to warn you that if he is gotten rid of, there will be no work done in this laboratory for at least a month, no matter what I try to do myself, and the effect may last for 6 months or a year because of the attitude of the scientific world, which did not appreciate the need of security." I think that attitude was prevalent in the country as a whole. It was very touchy, and you could not run this thing and say a man is either black or white. If he is black or has any tinge of it, out he goes, and there is no question about it. Does the name Weinberg mean anything to you? Oh, yes. Would you mind? Weinberg was one of, I think some of the people over there could maybe amplify it a little. He was, as I recall, one of 4 young scientists at Berkeley. The other names, if they are mentioned, I think I could remember them. Might I mention them to assist? Weinberg, Bohm, Lomnitz, and Friedman. That sounds very familiar, and I think that is approximately right. Essentially, they were a group about whom there was a great deal of question. I never had any confidence in them at all from the time that we started to get reports. They were not essential to the project. They were young men, and they could be replaced. But remember, at that time, there were not very many men, and even a young man, it was difficult to replace. But even so, we could get along without them. You did indeed in some cases. Oh, yes. The project was successful, and some of these men left the project. Yes, we got rid of them, but each one it was a terrible task to get rid of because it was not a case of my deciding he should go. First the suspicion of the man, then a development enough to convince me, and then manipulation and just how were we going to do this thing. It was just as difficult as to get rid of a cabinet officer in Washington that the country is behind, because you had all of the political play in there. Men who would become violently excited about the most minor thing. If I went on to the laboratory or on to a plant and failed to speak to somebody who was there or didn't see him, even at Oak Ridge, I even had to go back at the expense of about 3 hours one day to speak to a superintendent that I had failed to see when I went through the plant, and when he spoke to me, I had not answered him. When Nichols told me about it, I said, "What is the damage?" He said, "You just got to go back." So, sorry, the scan here is very low contrast. So it took about 3 hours with our location down there, and I went back. That was true. Everybody, with the exception of a few of us, like Nichols and myself, whose physical resistance maybe was better, everyone was worked to the point where they were tense and nervous, and they had to be soothed all the time. I say that so you get the picture of why certain people were not removed. You say, why didn't you remove them? Sure, I wanted to remove them, but it was not wise. I think it also important to state, I think it is well known, that there was never, from about 2 weeks from the time I took charge of this project, any illusion on my part but that Russia was our enemy, and that the project was conducted on that basis. I didn't go along with the attitude of the country as a whole that Russia was a gallant ally. I always had suspicions, and the project was conducted on that basis. Of course, that was so reported to the President. One other question about individuals. You said that Dr. Condon had been unsatisfactory in every respect. Does that include security? Did you have anything in mind on security in that regard, or loyalty? I would say not in giving any information, but in setting up. He set up the rules at Los Alamos. At least I always felt he was the man responsible for the rules that tended to break down compartmentalization. He was the man who was primarily responsible for Los Alamos for the friction which existed. There would have been friction anyway, but the intensity of the friction that existed between the military officers who were trying to do the administrative operations out there so as to enable the scientists to work at science, Condon was the one who built all of that up. The fact that he left there as he did, and left this mess behind him, he left because of the reasons that he did leave. The fact that he, of course, later, when he worked at Berkeley, he didn't do what I term an honest day's work, I might add for your clarification that the work he was engaged in at Berkeley was something that required a man of his capabilities. Dr. Condon was a first-rate physicist, don't misunderstand me. Lawrence and myself did not feel that this particular phase of the work was at all interesting to us. We thought it was just no hope at all. But we also felt that we could not allow this field to go unexplored, just because of a curbstone opinion, which is really what Lawrence and mine were because we didn't know anything about it. I don't remember what it was now. It involved mathematics to see if this was feasible. We had Condon working on that with a small group of juniors. By doing that, we definitely proved that we were right in saying that we should neglect it. He was kept on there at Berkeley on a sort of part-time basis, traveling back and forth. He was very unsatisfactory there. In other words, he just didn't do an honest day's work, in our opinion. He would also be going to Pittsburgh for his own family convenience. He would be leaving Pittsburgh because he wanted to get out to Berkeley for personal reasons. Then, of course, the situation came up with his attempts to go to Russia just before the bomb exploded, to that scientific conference where a member of our State Department kept the Army from knowing about these invitations. I found out about it because our scientists told me that they had received invitations. So we checked our project to see that none of our people would go, and then at the last minute, when the plane was about to leave, we suddenly discovered that some industrial scientists, namely Condon and Langmuir, of General Electric were going, and I then raised the question as to whether they should go with their top company officials. After discussion with GE, I withdrew any objection to Dr. Langmuir going. Of course, Dr. Langmuir has since represented that, but that is all right. I did not withdraw the objection to Condon going. I had the fullest support from the corporations concerned. Condon's passport was withdrawn, and he made a terrific battle to go. That battle was so unrealistic and so completely lacking in appreciation of what was the best interests of the United States that you couldn't help but feel that either he was such an utter fool that he could not be trusted, or else that he put his own personal desires above those of the welfare of the country, and therefore he was in effect disloyal, even if it was not a case of deliberately going out to aid the enemy. One other question about Dr. Condon. When he left Los Alamos and assumed this other relationship at Berkeley, did he have any responsibility for personnel at either place? He didn't leave directly for Berkeley. He was relieved from the project and went back to the Westinghouse Company. It was later that he was picked up to go to Berkeley because we wanted to take a man that would not hurt the project in any way. As to his responsibilities for personnel at Los Alamos, that was one of his big responsibilities, to assist in recruiting personnel. The idea was that Dr. Condon, in my concept, and I believe Dr. Oppenheimer, carried out that concept completely insofar as he felt that it was possible to carry it out, because we both found out pretty soon that Condon was not competent. Oppenheimer was to think the scientific problems and to establish the schedule of scientific and technical work. Condon was to run everything connected with the procurement of personnel, the operation of the personnel, their relations with the military, and all that. The military was to run the housekeeping. As I say, Condon failed in that. Oppenheimer started to move into the personnel thing. Of course, Oppenheimer still had at the beginning to get the senior personnel, but building up and getting all the arrangements was supposed to be Condon's responsibility. Now, I just want to interject here because I think, if I remember correctly, I think Condon was that one sort of scientist in the movie who, like the guy, he had glasses and he like rage quit the project pretty much, uh, the Manhattan Project, like halfway through, and Oppenheimer was like, "Oh, don't worry, like he won't be indiscreet, like he won't reveal anything." And then Groves made the joke like, "Oh, well, don't worry, we can just kill him if if he does." I feel like that's the guy they're talking about, although I don't think they ever mentioned the guy's name explicitly. I might actually look that up quickly if Dr. Condon was in the movie. Um, Again, it could have just been it's definitely a smaller reference, but let's see, Dr. Condon Oppenheimer movie. Edward Condon. Let's see. Uh, Legacy. Okay, in the 2023 film Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan, Condon was portrayed by actor Ali Haskevi. Filmography. Let's see. Ali Haskevi Oppenheimer. Oh yeah, that's him. I just recognized the face. Okay, so yeah, that's if you remember that scene from the movie, it was, a relatively minor scene. Uh, that I think is who they're talking about right now. So it's pretty clear that Groves did not like this guy, which is just kind of funny. He's just like, oh, I fucking hate this guy. Okay, so Yeah, I'll get back to it in a second. Okay. This is while he was identified with the project. Yes. When he left, he had no responsibility. That is right. He had no responsibility. He left with, I would say, both Dr. Oppenheimer and myself. We had the utmost distaste for Dr. Condon. There was the utmost cooperation in getting this thing on a plane, where you might say we had Dr. Condon on the record in a way that he has never liked to have it disclosed since, that he had not done a good job out there. My next question involves a considerable change of pace, General. That is all right, sir. Do you think that the Russian effort to develop this kind of weapon was in any way, as you look back on history, has has in any way, as you look back on history, been accelerated by information they may have gotten one way or another from our own people? Oh yes, there is no question. If I can go into that, uh, if I can go into that a little bit. First, they got information as to our interest essentially through espionage at Berkeley. These are all conclusions. You can't prove them, of course. I understand. They got the thought that we were interested there. They certainly had gotten before he ever came to the country. They must have gotten information from Fuchs that Britain was interested in this affair, and that we were too, because up until the time I came into control, there was a complete interchange of scientific information between Britain and America on this. If the British didn't know everything we were doing, it is because they were stupid, and they were not on the job. I don't think they did, but they knew most of it. The next disclosure outside of that particular thing is that whatever Fuchs passed during the war, and I don't think he passed too much until near the end, they undoubtedly knew certain things, they had good espionage, and they knew a lot of things that were going on. For example, when we had trouble at Hanford and our piles suddenly quit, I think that is generally known. Again, that is not secret, but I wouldn't like to have it repeated. We had trouble with our piles. The trouble existed because this was a sudden disclosure of a scientific effect that nobody had anticipated. The reason we had not anticipated that was because we had never operated our pile at Chicago, our preliminary work there, continuously. We had we had not operated continuously because my orders to the Chicago lab were directly and deliberately disobeyed. I had said that they will be operated continuously. We don't know what will happen. Let us find out. Of course, I didn't anticipate this scientific problem, but after all, any engineer knows you ought to operate something continuously. The power worked so well at Chicago that they operated it only during nice convenient hours. So we never got this effect that was so disastrous at Hanford. My officer in charge at Chicago failed because he didn't report that they were not carrying out my orders, which he should have done if he could not get them to comply. When this thing happened at Hanford, it was known by people that had no right to know it within. I can't recall the exact time now, I think it was 48 hours. It was known in New York by somebody who was not in the project. To get to New York, I had to trace out this thing. I think it went from Hanford to Chicago, which was legitimate. It went from Chicago to Montreal, which was not legitimate. It went from Montreal to someone else in Canada, and from that it went to New York. I didn't have to have that diagram. We found out that this man had an inkling that something had happened, and that was enough to show the extent of this kind of espionage. There was a great deal of loose talk about it by scientific people, as I say, breaking down my compartmentalization rules. Of course, I always knew that if you have this many people on a project, that somebody is going to be faithless and somebody is going to betray you, and that is why we had compartmentalization. Then, after the war, when the May case broke in Canada, that, of course, was pure luck, what May had done. Apparently, May gave to the Russians a sample of U-233 and a sample of something else. I think it was plutonium. I don't recall now, but the U-233 was all important because that indicated to the Russians that we were interested in thorium, which could only be produced that way. The result of that was most unfortunate. Then the next thing that happened was, I didn't know this until later, apparently there was a diary kept up there with certain names in it. I have never been able to get the truth of that, because people who were involved have clammed up. They were not people who were friendly to me in the main anyway. They were not people who would disclose matters to me. But I believe there was a diary. I believe Fuchs' name was in that diary, a list of acquaintances or addresses. That was in the hands of somebody in the Canadian ring. I've always thought it was Fuchs. It has been told it was somebody else. Fuchs' name was in that. That list was supposedly disclosed to people in the US, not in the project, but outside of the project, and the list was never shown to me. The one man who should have it had it shown to him by all means. There were attempts on the part of our government to keep me from knowing about this Canadian affair. I was told of it by Dr. Chadwick, the British scientific representative. I should have been told by our top officials, whoever got the first word from Canada. I should have been told. I was not consulted about it in any way. I think that led probably to the damage of Fuchs, that Fuchs did. Of course, the Fuchs case to me was a very bitter affair, because the British government deliberately lied about Fuchs. I said that with emphasis to the fullest. Not only did they lie once, they lied 3 times in writing. I first asked for this group of which Fuchs was a member. Have they been cleared? The answer was yes, they have been cleared. They are perfectly sound. I said that is not satisfactory. I have to have more than that. They came back then with a letter that said these men had been Q cleared by our investigative agencies over in England. I think they call it what is it, G5 or something of that kind. In other words, a combination of military intelligence and the FBI. I refuse to accept that. Then they came through and said that these men, and they named them, including Fuchs, have all been cleared on the same standards which you would use in this country for men who were going to know the same things. They brought up at that time, or shortly thereafter, or shortly before, that some of the men coming over were of German birth, that they were not English citizens, that some of them had been made English citizens by Act of Parliament. Frisch was related to Elisa Meitner, or was at least a nephew of Pierre's and Sir John Simon. Either were not British citizens or were made British citizens by an Act of Parliament. In other words, they had not fulfilled the usual requirements. Never did they mention that Fuchs was German-born, or was being made a citizen, or had been by Act of Parliament; that Fuchs was a communist, or had a communist background; that Fuchs had been interested in Canada as a German, and then released all of the things that would have made me say, well, leave Fuchs at home. None of that was given. That's kind of funny. I, just one kind of funny comment here that he says, never did they mention that Fuchs was German born. His name's Fuchs. What do you think? Anyway, uh, I'll continue. As I say, it was repeated, and they knew what the story was, and yet they brought Fuchs over. Unfortunately, Fuchs was in the delegation of British who came and discussed with us the gaseous diffusion process, which was the one process we had that we really took our hair down and told them all about, because the feeling was that they had initiated that process and they could be helpful. I will say here, Fuchs was, I think, the only member of the project who, like, again, this is in the movie, that he later turns out to be a Russian spy, uh, and it, like, gets revealed, and, it's a huge problem. And it seems that General Groves is, whether fairly or not, he's trying to shift the blame onto the British for the clearance of Fuchs, because he's like, Not my problem, okay? It's not my fault that we let this spy onto the project. So he's trying to keep his own record clean on that. Anyway, there was also a very strong element, I would say 98 to 99% of the scientific personnel on the project who considered the gas diffusion process a mistake, including including the people who were actually responsible for the development. Dr. Urey, who was the head, violently opposed it. He said it couldn't possibly work, so it was not unreasonable to let the British look at it. That's interesting. Dr. Urey, I didn't know he was involved in the Manhattan Project. He's famous for the Urey-Miller experiment, which showed that I think it's the same guy. I haven't heard of any other Ureys out there. Uh, Basically, he and Miller ran this experiment where they simulated the conditions on early Earth and showed the spontaneous generation of amino acids, which was the sort of first evidence in the field of abiogenesis, or how life began on Earth. How did dead matter become living matter? And that experiment showed that amino acids could be spontaneously generated uh, in the conditions of early Earth. And now we've found amino acids like all over the solar system. Like we found the signatures, and that's pretty interesting. Of course, there has not yet been an experiment that has shown the full development of life in an abiogenetic process, right? So, amino acids is very far from a full cell or something like that. But, this was like 1954, so this was like the initial steps. Uh, and I find that field pretty interesting, the field of abiogenesis, because it's very mysterious and very fascinating. Um, it's like a mix between evolutionary science and chemistry. But yeah, anyway. Okay. Of course, as you know, and is well known, I was not responsible for our close cooperation with the British. I did everything to hold back on it. I would say perfectly frankly, I did the things that I have sort of, maybe by implication, blamed on my scientists for doing. I did not carry out the wishes of our government with respect to cooperation with the British because I was leaning over backwards. That information that Fuchs gave was all important. The mistake that was made at Los Alamos in breaking down compartmentalization was vital to Fuchs because Fuchs later went to Los Alamos. It was vital to Fuchs and the information he passed to the Russians. But in doing that, I think it is important to realize this with respect to Fuchs. If we had limited it to a small group, say just the top people, Fuchs might still have been in that group. Fuchs would also have worked on the hydrogen bomb as one of the subordinates, and would have passed that information. With the British not being completely under my control, I think it would have been passed on by the British group to Fuchs, whether we had the compartmentalization strictly observed there or not. But irrespective of that, I feel that was one of the disadvantages of the breakdown of compartmentalization. You think there was information, and it seems clear that Fuchs was involved in the transmission of information. You think it was confined exclusively to Fuchs? No, I think the data that went out in the case of the Rosenbergs was of minor value. I would never say that publicly. Again, that is something, while it is not secret, I think should be kept very quiet. Because irrespective of the value of that in the overall picture, the Rosenbergs deserved to hang, and I would not like to see anything that would make people say General Groves thinks they didn't do much damage after all. On the situation as a whole, our reliance when we first talked after the war about what the time limits were on the Russians, and it is quite possible I talked to you about it when you were Secretary of the Army. I don't recall, I certainly made no bones about it. Our reliance on what the Russians could or could not do was based on primarily the supplies of material which I felt would be available to them. That is raw material, and on the basis that there would be no general relaxation of security rules beyond the Smith report and the declassification study which said what could be released. In that, the criterion and that criterion was established by a committee of eminent scientists, but like all committees, it was under pretty rigid control by me because I had the chairman, Dr. Tolman, who was in complete sympathy with me as far as I know. I had the secretary, who was an officer and a distinguished chemist handling that end. And they were told in advance what should be the criterion, and they got the board to agree to that criterion. Nothing was recommended for declassification where it was felt that would be of any assistance to the Russians in developing the bomb. Later, that has been stretched and stretched, and there has been a tremendous amount of data published. As you know, I fought the battle. I did not win. The American people and the Congress and everybody else was opposed to me. It has always been said, get the information out, and there has been a great laxness there. I think the primary reason was that the Russians got into these. Oh, shoot. My headphones came un. Let me just check to make sure that the audio is still good on the live stream. Okay, I think everything looks good here. Um, yeah, okay, that was weird. Okay, everything looks good as far as I can tell. Okay. I think the primary reason was that the Russians got into these materials in Saxony. In Saxony. We didn't know about, and I am sure he did. We were never too much concerned about that because I personally felt that the electromagnetic process was a process, while it was of extreme importance to us during the war, and we saved at least a year's time by doing it, that was not the process we would follow after the war. That is one reason why we put silver in those magnets, because we knew we would get it out. General Groves, I would like to ask one question that is not very important, and maybe you can't answer it. There are some things that appear in magazines that is almost classified information. That article in Life, do you remember seeing that? No, I didn't read that. I think it was Life. It contained a lot of material that I did not think was unclassified. Did any of you people read that article? I have not read that, but I can tell you that I am constantly being shocked by what I see. With respect to that, to clarify a little my previous answer to Mr. Gray, because I am reminded of this by your question. During the war, there were two things that came out that annoyed me tremendously. The last one was kind of funny, but it still annoyed me. I thought that I thought that is an awfully cheap thing to do. As you know, we had the utmost cooperation from the. Huh, that's weird. Again, a little missing. I don't know, something wrong. Anyway, I will just read what the text says. I don't know what it's trying to say. Anyway, as you know, we had the utmost cooperation from the. That is very definite. Our relationship our relationships were generally good, but on one occasion a newspaper wanted to print news about Hanford and what a tremendous development was out there. They had their reporter out and they had their story written, and it was a bang-up story. We found out about it, and they were told no, they could not print it. Of course, that was handled through press censorship. We didn't deal directly with them. They said there are thousands of people that know it, and they would not agree with our philosophy, which was that thousands of people could know it, but that is no sign the Russians did, or the enemy. We could not talk about the Russians too much then. So that they agreed not to publish it. About a month afterwards, a congressman from Oregon, I think his name was Angel, suddenly made a speech on the floor of the House appealing for more appropriations for the Interior Department for, I think, installation of electric generators in Grand Coulee, or something of that kind. And among other things, he said that there was this tremendous plant with great electrical demand at Hanford, Washington. The paper came out with this. I was a little squib on the interior page. It said the congressional directory contained the following today, and it just quoted that absolutely. As I say, I thought it was awfully poor. I knew it had not been top management. I think it was somebody who got smart. But there was one very serious break that disclosed during the war. To me, if I had been a Russian, I think if the intelligence of Kapitsa and the background or the intelligence of anyone else who was working on this project, it would have indicated that the way to produce an atomic bomb was in some way to take care that it might be based on implosion. I don't know if anyone else in the room saw that article. I think I probably discussed it with Dr. Oppenheimer at the time. I saw it. It was a terrible article. There just was not anything we could do. I was just as certain as I could be that somebody was just trying to get that information out. I don't know who was responsible. We, of course, did almost nothing about it because that is the kind of thing you don't do anything about. We prevented in this country the republication of articles appearing abroad, particularly in Scandinavian papers that disclosed ideas. We made no mention, for example, in the press dispatches when the heavy water plant was finally destroyed in Norway. They might be described in detail in the Scandinavian press. We objected and were successful in having them not reprinted on the ground that would indicate to the Russians some interest. I don't know how successful we were in keeping the Russians from realizing what a tremendous effort this was, and how hopeful we were, and what the effects would be, but judging from the Russians' attitude, I would say that they did not appreciate the strength of this weapon until it dropped on Hiroshima, and they were told of its effects. They still did not appreciate it until after Bikini, because the attitude of the Russian delegation at the UN, which of course was very responsive to Moscow, as you know, changed completely. Not immediately after the explosion, but within about 24 hours of the time that the ships returned to San Francisco, and the Russian observers who were there against my wishes, as you know, I did not control Bikini, got ashore and went to the Russian consulate. Within 24 hours to 48 hours, the whole attitude of the Russian delegation at the UN changed, and this became a very serious matter, instead of just being something, oh, well, it doesn't amount to much. That would indicate to me that they had not been convinced by their espionage of just how important this was. So that's very interesting. He mentions a few things. It's interesting, how much censorship of the press went on during World War II. Of course, that's like a wartime emergency power. Uh, it violates the First Amendment, right? The freedom of the press, but that is incredibly common in history, in American history during wartime. Like Lincoln arrested a bunch of journalists, I think, and this basically happens whenever the U.S. is in a major war. And that is interesting, just from the perspective of like thinking of like the internet and modern technology and how that would happen today. How he's like, stuff would get published in the Scandinavian press, but we wouldn't allow American press to repeat it, and that basically guarantees that no American's going to see it. But it's interesting because nowadays, if some article or video gets published in Scandinavia, Americans can see it, even if no one in America reports on it, but just because of the internet. Um, Although I don't doubt that the government has measures that they could take in the event of some. So if we were to get into a war on the same scale as World War II, to censor information on the internet if they really wanted to. It is just interesting, though, to think of the technological development and how that changes things in this regard, like how the modern day compares to history. But then another thing that's interesting, he mentions the destruction of the heavy water plant in Norway. Uh, Norway was occupied by Germany in World War II, and there was this heavy water plant there, which is a plant that basically separates out uh, water that has, normal one proton hydrogen from water that has deuterium in it, which is hydrogen with one proton and one neutron, so-called heavy water. And heavy water was used in nuclear reactors. I'm not sure if it still is today. It might be. Uh, but it was considered important to the development of an atomic bomb. And so there was a team led by, I believe it was the British government, of ex like Norwegian soldiers who had fled from the Nazi occupation to Britain. They were a team that went back into Norway and blew up this plant to slow down the Nazi development of an atomic bomb. And I read a whole book on the subject when I was in ninth grade, so like 5 or 6 years ago now. Uh, and I forget what the book was called. Uh, just in case anyone's interested here, I'll see if I can look it up. Um, let's see. Heavy Water Norway Sabotage book. Let's see if I can. Okay, I think it was. Yeah, I think this is the book. So it was called Operation Gunnerside. That was the operation to sabotage this plant. Uh, and I think the book I read was Neil Bascombe's 2016 The Winter Fortress: The Epic Mission to Sabotage Hitler's Atomic Bomb. Let's see if I can recognize the cover. I'm gonna look this up because I remember the cover of the book distinctly. Okay, opening up Amazon. Yeah, okay, that was the book. So yeah, this is the book if anyone's interested in reading more about. This book is less like focused on the science. It's more focused on the espionage, the intrigue, and that sort of thing. But it's a really interesting book, so I would recommend checking that out if you're interested to learn more about that whole situation. So yeah, okay, let's get back to the transcript. Okay, Mr. Garrison, redirect examination. Okay, let me pull him back down here. Okay. General, Dr. Oppenheimer had no responsibility for the selection or the clearance of Fuchs, did he? No, not at all. He had no responsibility whatsoever, as far as I can remember. He had no responsibility for it, and I don't recall his ever having asked me to get an Englishman at the laboratory in any way, nor did he suggest their need. He acquiesced when I said I thought we should get them there in view of things, and because we desperately needed certain assistance that those men can give. They were a scientific reservoir. There was not any use in trying to keep them out, as I saw the picture. In other words, I tried to be reasonable about it. I didn't try to oppose the administration when I knew I was going to get licked. After all, I had been in Washington for many, many years. All this talk about espionage, you didn't mean to suggest by anything that you said with respect to it that Dr. Oppenheimer had anything whatever to do with espionage activities with foreign agents. Oh, by no means. Dr. Oppenheimer was responsible as the director of the laboratory for assisting in every possible way our security and defense against espionage at Los Alamos. If you look down the chart, he might be responsible to a certain degree for operation of the security officer. It was more in the way of assisting that officer and of advising me or this officer's superiors if he thought the officer was not doing a good job. But the officer, from a practical standpoint, did not report to Oppenheimer excepting as a matter of courtesy. So you would not want to leave with this board even by the remotest suggestion that you are here questioning Dr. Oppenheimer's basic loyalty to the United States in the operation of the Los Alamos plant. By no means, and nothing about the espionage. I think it is very important, if there has been any misunderstanding, that Dr. Oppenheimer was not in any way responsible for anything to do with the protection of the United States against espionage, accepting cooperation, which was natural, as the head of the scientific effort out there. By no means was there any intent to imply. I hope I did not lead anybody to think otherwise for an instant. After Dr. Oppenheimer resigned as the director of the project, did he remain as a consultant for the Manhattan District? Apparently he did. I didn't realize that until somebody asked me about it, or something was said here earlier. I think he did. I don't think he was on the payroll in any way, but certainly I would not have hesitated to ask him any questions or to discuss anything that was of a secret nature during that period I remained in control. For one thing, there was nothing that came up with which he was not already thoroughly familiar. There was no possibility of anything in that. So the question never arose. I think also, as I recall, he was a member of this declassification board, although I'm not certain of that. That would be in the record, and of course he would know. That was the one chairmaned by Dr. Tolman. You have given in your interpretation of the requirements of the Atomic Energy Act, General Groves. Leaving the act to one side, or supposing that it provided that the test of the employment of a man in Dr. Oppenheimer's position should be what is in the public interest, would you say that the revocation of his employment would be in the public interest if that is the way the act read? The revocation under such extreme publicity as has occurred I think would be most unfortunate, not because of the effect on Dr. Oppenheimer, that I leave to one side, but because of what might be a very disastrous effect upon the attitude of the academic scientists of this country towards doing government research of any kind, and particularly when there was not any war on. I think you can refer back to history as to the attitude of the average academic man in 1945 when the war was over. They were exactly like the average private in the army, who said to himself, "The war is over. How soon can I get back home to Mom and get out of this uniform?" That was the way the average academic scientist felt. He wanted out. He wanted to be where he could resume his old academic life, and where he could talk and not have to be under pressure of any kind. What happened is what I expected, that after they had this extreme freedom for about 6 months, they all started to get itchy feet. And as you know, almost every one of them has come back into government research because it was just too exciting. And I think still is exciting. Does that answer your question? Yes. I have, General, a copy of a letter which I am sure you recall from yourself to Dr. Oppenheimer, dated May 18, 1950. I would like to read it, if I may, into the record. I'm sure you have no objection to that. No. Anything I wrote I have no objection to whatever. This is on the letterhead of Remington Rand Incorporated, Laboratory of Advanced Research, South Norwalk, Connecticut. Oh, that's funny, South Norwalk. I used to live near there. May 18, 1950. Okay. Dear Dr. Oppenheimer, if at any time you should feel that it were wise, I would be pleased to have you make a statement of the general tenor of that which follows. General Groves has informed me that shortly after he took over the responsibility for the development of the atomic bomb, he reviewed personally the entire file and all known information concerning me, and immediately ordered that I be cleared for all atomic information, in order that I might participate in the development of the atomic bomb. General Groves has also informed me that he personally went over all information concerning me which came to light during the course of operations of the atomic project, and that at no time did he regret his decision. I don't believe that you will find any need to make use of such statement, but you might. You might wish to show it to some individual for his use in handling unpleasant situations, if any arise. I have been very much pleased with the comments that have been made by various persons in whose judgment I have more than average faith, such as the reported statement of Representative Nixon that he has complete confidence in Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty. This was made in a speech at Oakdale, California. That's funny. This is before Nixon's president, obviously, by like 15 years. Anyway, I am sure of one thing, and that is that this type of attack, while it is unpleasant, does not in the end do real damage to one's reputation. I wonder if you saw the editorial in the Washington Post to the effect that the way to cripple the U.S. atomic energy program would be to single out a few of the foremost nuclear physicists and dispose of them by character assassination. When I remember how the Post has written about me, it makes me wonder just who wrote this particular editorial. I do hope that you are finding life enjoyable and not too hectic, and that I will have the pleasure of seeing you again before too long. My very best to Mrs. Oppenheimer. Sincerely yours, signed Leslie R. Groves, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army. General, if Dr. Oppenheimer had had occasion to make this statement public, needless to say it would have been the quoted portion as set forth in your letter, but I think it appropriate in this executive session to put the whole letter in the record and ask you if the expressions of confidence in him contained in this letter you wrote hold. I think the letter is something that was absolutely what I thought at the time that I wrote it. I think if you interpret it in that light and know what has happened since, that you can draw your own conclusions as to what I feel today. That is all. May I ask another question? Yes. Okay, so now recross examination. General Groves, I show you the memorandum which you wrote to the Secretary of War under date of March 24, 1947, and ask you if you recall writing that. No, I don't recall. Oh, yes, surely I recall writing this. I know I wrote it because, again, my signature is there and nobody ever successfully forged it. That's kind of funny that he keeps mentioning it. Like, oh, yeah, no one has forged my signature yet, so yeah, I trust you. Anyway, um, I think it might be well, Mr. Chairman, so the record would be complete if I read this in the record too. Memorandum to the Secretary of War. Subject: Loyalty clearance of Dr. J.R. Oppenheimer. In accordance with our telephonic conversation, I express below my views relative to the loyalty of Dr. Oppenheimer. When I was first placed in charge of the atomic bomb development in September 1942, I found a number of persons working on the project who had not received proper security clearances. One of these was Dr. Oppenheimer, who had been studying certain of the theoretical problems concerning the explosive force of the bomb. The security organization, then not under my control, did not wish to clear Dr. Oppenheimer because of certain of his associations, particularly those of the past. After consideration of the availability and caliber of suitable scientists, I decided that it would be in the best interests of the U.S. to use Dr. Oppenheimer's services. Prior to this, I reviewed Dr. Oppenheimer's complete record personally. It was apparent to me that he would not be cleared in any agency whose sole responsibility was military security. Nevertheless, my careful study made me feel that in spite of that record, he was fundamentally a loyal American citizen, and that in view of his potential overall value to the project, he should be employed. I ordered accordingly that he be cleared for the Manhattan Project. Since then, I have learned many things amplifying that record, but nothing which, if known to me at that time, would have changed my decision. In connection with the above statement, it must be remembered that the provisions of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 did not control my actions prior to the enactment of that law. My decisions in respect to clearances of personnel were based on what I believed to be the best overall interests of the United States under the then existing circumstances. As I have long since informed the Atomic Energy Commission, I do not consider that all persons cleared for employment by the Manhattan District, while under my command, should be automatically cleared by the AEC, but that the Commission should exercise its own independent judgment based on present circumstances. Signed, Leslie Groves, Major General. Might I ask the date? March 24, 1947. I thought I read that. Oh, you did. Do you care to comment on that? Yes, I would like to comment on that. Yes, sir. It is my recollection, and particularly reinforced by those letters that you read previously, and something that appeared in some paper which I know was true, that it was about this time that the AEC reviewed this question of Dr. Oppenheimer's usefulness on the project. They apparently, I think at that time, that they actually reviewed it. And the paper stated it was March 8th that Lilienthal got a telephone call, or that it was taken up by the commission in response to a letter or something of information from J. Edgar Hoover. I believe I was in Florida at the time because I had gone down there about that time to try to get away from Washington, and particularly to get away so that I would not be in Washington during the confirmation fight on the Hill on Lilienthal and the other commissioners. The War Department insisted on my coming back. They thought, I think, 10 days was enough leave for me. They exerted all kinds of pressure on the Surgeon General, and I was finally sort of forced to come back much sooner than I wanted to come back. It was not health, it was just a case I wanted to be out of Washington during that time. I thought it was wise from the standpoint of everybody. Glad to have had. Oh, wait. Yeah. Glad to have had you as a witness. Hmm. Oh, shit. There's a page missing. Um, Let me see. I didn't think this volume had any classified pages, so let me just see if I can. I'll just check that. Um, there it is, volume. Oh, wait, no, that's 6. These are all Roman numeraled, so. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so there's a page missing, but, uh, okay. So I thought it was wise from the standpoint of everybody. Cut. Glad to have had you as a witness. Thank you very much for letting me come in. We will take a recess now, gentlemen. Brief recess. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know what's up there with the missing pages. This is just what I have from the Secretary, or from the Department of Energy website. I don't know. I don't know why it's missing, but we'll get back to the hearing in just a sec. But yeah, so definitely a mixed testimony there uh, from Groves as to Oppenheimer's, loyalties and stuff. Groves definitely seems like a very like stereotypical like military man of he doesn't like to deal with, you know, commies and stuff like that. But he doesn't even like to deal with Britain, which is like a very close ally, no question of loyalty with Britain. He's like, the Brits don't know what they're doing, blah blah blah. It's a very stereotypical like American military guy. And so, his testimony was not entirely favorable to Oppenheimer. It wasn't terrible either, though, I would say. Uh, yeah. So that was interesting because I think he was a witness for the defense. So it's interesting that they brought him in, even though his testimony was like if I was like a defense lawyer, Okay, I don't know how law works, but I would imagine that a defense lawyer would be like, okay, we're only going to bring someone in who is going to have a very strong support of us. Isn't there a saying in law, something like, don't ask a question of a witness that you don't already know the answer to, right? So I feel like Garrison kind of failed to enact that principle because some of the questions he asked and some of the answers he got, I feel like are answers that he would not have liked to get. But maybe that was sort of weighed in the fact that Groves was such an important figure in the Manhattan Project, especially with his close work relationship with Oppenheimer, that they were willing to take a few hits just because of the reliability of his testimony. Because some of the other testimony, like so far, I think we've only had one other witness other than Oppenheimer himself, who was the president of Bell Labs and who only like worked with Oppenheimer on like a committee after the war. And so his testimony might not be as weighty, like it might not be considered with as much gravity. So it was important to get Groves' testimony, even if it wasn't like the most favorable for Oppenheimer. That would be my guess as to the rationale behind that decision. But anyway, I'm no lawyer, so I have no idea. But yeah, let's continue. Okay, Mr. Robb, are you ready? Okay, so the hearing is changing now. Groves has left, and Oppenheimer is testifying more. All right. All right. Mr. Robb, are you ready? Yes, sir. Whereupon J. Robert Oppenheimer, a witness having been previously duly sworn, was recalled to the stand and testified further as follows. Cross-examination resumed by Mr. Robb. Dr. Oppenheimer, yesterday we discussed for a little bit David Joseph Bohm. Do you recall that? I recall most of it, I think. You testified that in accord with your letter of answer to General Nichols that you asked for the transfer of Bohm to Los Alamos. Do you recall that? Surely. What did you know about David Joseph Bohm's academic background? In other words, his record as a scholar. He was a good student, a very good student. Where had he been a student? At Berkeley. Do you recall that his grades were not very good at Berkeley? No, I think the grades he got from me were probably good. He has made a very great name for himself as a scientist. You testified, as I recall, that you had seen Bohm and Lominitz at Princeton before they appeared and testified before the House Committee. This was pure accident. I was walking from the barber. Thereafter you read the transcript of their testimony. Yes, I don't know how carefully I read it, but I read it. It was a matter of interest to you, though, was it not? Naturally. Did you notice that both Bohm and Lominitz declined to answer upon the ground of possible self-incrimination when asked whether or not they knew Steve Nelson? I recognize that. Did that make any particular impression upon you? I concluded that they did not. I concluded that they did know him. You also concluded, did you not, that the fact that they knew him might cause them to be incriminated in some criminal proceeding? Right. It was not an unreasonable conclusion on your part, was it, that the criminal matter might be espionage? I had been told in that interview in the spring of 1946 with the FBI that the investigation concerned their joining the Communist Party. But didn't you conclude when you read their testimony refusing to admit or answer whether or not they knew Nelson that they might have been involved in espionage with Nelson? I didn't conclude that they were. I didn't conclude anything, sir. Didn't you conclude that they might have been? I didn't draw any conclusion. What did you think they might have been incriminated in by their answers? Membership in the Communist Party? Is that all? That is all I knew about. Did you see Bohm after he testified? I am sure I did. Did you talk with him about his testimony? No. You did not cross him off your list of friends after he testified, did you? We were in Princeton not really friends. We were acquaintances. I didn't cut him. I didn't run away from him. I don't believe there was any real problem. Was there any change whatever in your relationship with and your attitude towards Boehm after he testified? I was worried about his testimony. I didn't like it. Was there any change in your relationship with Boehm or your attitude toward him? My attitude I have just described. Was there any change in your relationship? I find it hard to answer that question because the relationship was not a very substantial one. You said you were worried about his testimony. What did you mean by that? I don't like it when people that I know have to plead the Fifth Amendment. But you testified yesterday that you would, had he asked you, given him a letter of recommendation after that. A letter of recommendation as a competent physicist. Boehm is publishing scientific articles now, is he? He is. What university is he at? University of Technical Institute or something at Sao Paulo, Brazil. Did you know a man by the name of Mario Schoenberg? I think that is right. I was there last summer and I didn't see Schoenberg. Do you know him? No. Do you know anything about him? He is reputed to be an active communist. You have been told he was? Yes. Did you and certain other persons sign a letter in his behalf in 1952, I believe it was? Schoenberg? Yes, sir. I don't remember it. I was told he was a communist last summer when I was in Brazil. I would like to ask if this was referred to in General Nichols' letter. Do you recall? Not specifically, no, but it was covered in general terms. May we pass on to something else while we try to find it? Let me stipulate. I learned of Schoenberg as a rather great scandal among the physicists in Brazil last summer. I don't know what the incident involving him was or what the problem involving him was, but obviously if there is a petition or letter of record, I don't want to put you to the trouble of digging it up. Yes. You want to see it? I just want to call attention to the fact that this letter was not specifically referred to. Garrison, here, wait, let me move him out of the way because he's not testifying anymore. Okay. And this guy never talks, so let me move him out of the way. Just trying to organize things a little bit. Okay. I just want to call attention to the fact that this letter was not specifically referred to. This is totally new to us. We have never heard of the man as far as counsel is concerned. I'm calling your attention to the fact that it is probably something new. We do not have it here. I'll come back to it. Will you return to this? Yes, sir. I should not stipulate anything. No, not as to a letter you couldn't remember. I don't remember. Mr. Chairman, I would like to request at this point that, subject to check by you with counsel, that this whole matter of Dr. Oppenheimer's relations, if any, with this man, Schoenberg, be not considered a part of the record until the item has been checked. This portion of the record, beginning with the first question about Schoenberg at this point, will be stricken until you are prepared to read the letter. I have it here now, sir. Was that your suggestion? No, I would like to make sure it does have some relation to Boehm or Lomnitz or some one of the people mentioned here. Otherwise, it is completely new, and I think we should have a little notice of it if we may. That is what I meant by a check. I think it would be well for counsel to read the letter and see whether you wish to make any suggestions. I will show this photostat to the doctor and ask him if he did in fact sign this letter. I am sorry about the date, doctor. It was in 1948. Would you show it to us? Yes, indeed. Why don't you let us take a look at it first, Mr. Robb? I will identify my signature and the company, but I will also shut up. Mr. Chairman, I think, strictly speaking, it is not within the purview of the letter, but we have no objection at all to its being read. Very well. Doctor, I will read you this letter, or rather a photostat of it. At the top, it bears the typewritten legend, Dispatch number 743, June 1, 1948, to Department E.P. Keeler, Elledge. Below that, in printing, Palmer Physical Laboratory, Princeton University, Princeton, New Jersey, May 20th, 1948. Stamped American Embassy, June 1, 1948. The Honorable Herschel V. Johnson, American Ambassador to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. My dear Mr. Ambassador, Professor Mario Schoenberg, who was a guest in your laboratories at Princeton for several months a number of years ago, we have heard to the dismay of all of us, has been imprisoned at Sao Paulo since March 30th without any formal accusation nor any legal process. Can you do something to have his case reviewed? Schoenberg has made significant contributions to mechanics, classical and quantum electrodynamics, astrophysics, and cosmic ray particles. He is the leader of the School of Theoretical Physics at Sao Paulo. His imprisonment has stopped not only the work of one of the leading Brazilian scientists, but also his training of new Brazilian scientists, which is possibly even more serious. We have been told that Schoenberg is a communist. It would appear most unfortunate if the apparently illegal imprisonment of Schoenberg could be used by communists and fellow travelers to make him into a martyr for civil liberties. Both on this account and for the sake of science, we hope you can do something either to get him freed directly or to have him brought to a fair trial. Respectfully yours, P.A.M. I think it says Dirac with an E, but I'm going to guess that's Dirac. Professor of Mathematical Physics, Institute for Advanced Study. Oh, and then, Befschates, a bunch of people signed this. Oppenheimer's a signatory. John A. Wheeler is a signatory. He came up a few hearings ago, and I made a video about him or his theory, the one electron universe theory. Eugene Signer. So yeah, a bunch of people signed this. Did you sign that letter, sir? My signature is authentic. Had you known Schoenberg before this? It is my impression that I had not. I don't have an image of what he looks like. I was not in Princeton some years prior to that letter. Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Robb is going to pursue a line of questioning about this, which is, so far as we are concerned, new matter, we make no technical objection to its being introduced, I think it would be fair if we might have a 5-minute recess to discuss with Dr. Oppenheimer what he knows about this. Why don't I defer this matter until after the luncheon recess? All right. Doctor, do you have before you your letter of answer to General Nichols again? I do. Will you turn to page 7, the middle paragraph, where you state, quote, I contributed to various organizations for Spanish relief. Can you tell us what they were? I mentioned the North American Committee yesterday afternoon. That is the one whose name sticks in my mind, but there were others. Do you recall any others? I have forgotten the name of the other, or rival organization. There was something about medical aid, an organization devoted to that. I believe you said your contributions were mostly in cash? I think so. I am not very clear about it. You told us something of Dr. Addis yesterday, and also Rudy Lambert, who is mentioned in the next paragraph. Addis was either a communist or very close to a communist. Yes. Lambert was a communist, to your knowledge? Right. You told us that Addis died, I think in 1950, is that right? I'm not sure of that date. Approximately then. Approximately. You say here, quote, Addis asked me perhaps in the winter of 1937 to 38 to contribute through him to the Spanish cause. Do you recall the circumstances under which he made that request to you? He invited me to come to his laboratory to talk to me about it. And you went. I went. Did you talk to him privately? Yes. What did he say to you? He said, you are giving all this money through these relief organizations. If you want to do good, let it go through communist channels, through Communist Party channels, and it will really help. Is that all he said? That is the substance of it. Was there anything said about the amount of your contributions? He said what I could. Did you tell him what you thought you could? I don't think I made up my mind at that time. Did there come a time when you did? No, except as we went on. Then you say, quote, he made it clear that this money, unlike that which went to the relief organizations, would go straight to the fighting effort. What do you mean by the fighting effort? I understand that it meant getting men into Spain in an international brigade and getting equipment for them. That is what I understood. This was, I believe, an illegal operation, but I'm not sure. Were you so advised at the time? I was not advised, no. Is that why you made your contributions in cash? I think it would have been a good reason for it. I ought to say that I did a great deal of my business in cash. Was there any other reason for making your contributions in cash? I think I have stated it. You have stated the specific reason. Wasn't the reason in general that you wanted to conceal them? I didn't want to advertise them, certainly. Reading further from your answer at the top of page 8, quote, I did so contribute usually when he communicated with me explaining the nature of the need. How often would he communicate with you to explain the nature of the need? I would think maybe 5 or 6 times during the time I was in Berkeley, a year. 5 or 6 times a year? Yes. What would be the nature of the need that he would explain? First it was the war, and then later it was something else. He would tell me about the fighting. He would tell me that they were hard up. He would paint the picture of the desperate situation as it rapidly developed and what money could do for it. You said later on it was something else. What was that? That was the problem of getting the Spanish loyalists out of the camps in France and getting them resettled. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking of this in contemporary terms, but in the terms that I understood in those days. What do you think now the need was? I think probably if the money went through communist channels, the money was to rescue communists. You knew it was going through communist channels. I knew it. For how many years did that go on? You have fixed the date in early 1942. I have the feeling that it is about right. You mean you think your last contribution was probably in early 1942? Yes, in early 1942. Starting in 1937 or earlier? Yes. In other words, it continued for approximately 4 years? Yes. What was the average yearly amount that you gave through those channels? I never totaled it up. I know that. I should think more than 500 and less than 1,000. Doctor, I don't mean to pry into irrelevant matters of your personal life or affairs, but your income during those years was probably between $15,000 and $20,000 a year, wasn't it? No, that's on the high side. Would it have been 15,000? I think my salary was 5,000. I have not looked it up. I believe we got about 8,000 or so in dividends and interests. Doctor, I'm not trying to trap you. No, it was not under 12,000 and not over 18,000. I've looked at your income tax return for I think 1942 and it seemed to me to be about 15,000. Good. That was your state income tax return, so that it would be perfectly possible for you to give him $1,000 a year or even more, wouldn't it? Sure. I was not using the money I had for my personal needs. You might have given him as much as $150 a month on the average. That is a leading question. Yes, I know. I could have as far as the money I had available. And you have no definite recollection as to just how much you did give him? I remember once giving him 300 in cash. In cash. What was the need that he explained to you for that money? I believe that was just before the end in Spain, that is, of the war. What was the need? The need was to prevent defeat. You mean more cartridges or something? More people? Your testimony is that Addis started you off on this, or rather your answer states that Addis started you off, and your testimony is too, and there is a time when he brought in Isaac Folkoff. Right. He told me he had been giving the money to Folkoff, and Folkoff would explain things just as well. Was any reason given to you why Folkoff executed for Addis? None. By the way, where did you usually give him this money? In your house or where? Sometimes when he was coming to Berkeley. More often I went to San Francisco and very often went to visit him in his laboratory or in his home. It wasn't a regular meeting. Sometimes we met casually and he talked to me and we would fix a meeting. May I ask the clarification whether the he refers to Folkoff or Addis? I am talking about Addis. Did you follow the same system with Folkoff? Yes. Was there any difference? No, except that Folkoff came less frequently to Berkeley. Did you ever go to Folkoff's house or office to give him money? I don't remember his office or his house, but I won't at this stage deny it. About when was that when Folkoff came into the picture? I don't remember. I can make a guess, in 1940, but it is a guess. You testified that Addis told you Folkoff would take over and he would explain things to you, is that correct? Yes. What did Folkoff explain to you? With one or two exceptions, it was all the business about the refugees, the camps in France, the resettlement problems, and how much it cost and how much it cost to get to Mexico, and all the rest. This was the campaign. What were the exceptions? I remember one. The one I remember was a campaign, this occurred more than once, to organize the migratory labor in the California Valley. I understood that communists were involved in that. I was about to ask you a campaign by whom, and the answer would be by the communists. Right. You say in your answer, quote, sometimes I was asked for money for other purposes, the organization of migratory labor in the California valleys, for instance. That is what you have reference to? Right. What were any of the other purposes besides that? Besides these three I mentioned, I don't recollect. You do recall there were others. I have the impression there were others. Was it your procedure to cash a check and then turn the cash over to either Addis or Folkoff? I presume I got the money from the bank. You had a checking account. I had a checking account. You say in your answer, quote, in time these contributions came to an end. I went to a big Spanish relief party the night before Pearl Harbor, and the next day, as we heard the news of the outbreak of war, I decided that I had had about enough of the Spanish cause, and that there were other and more pressing crises in the world. Doctor, the Spanish cause was identified in your mind with the Communist Party, wasn't it? Not as clearly as it has been since. The International Brigade, I think, in fact, was not purely communist. It was certainly communist organized. In all events, your contributions were strictly made to the communists. Absolutely. You did not feel any revulsion against the communists until after Pearl Harbor. I don't believe this indicates revulsion. Did you, at the time of Pearl Harbor, feel any revulsion against the Communist Party? That is much too strong a word. You did not? Not anything as strong as revulsion, no. You were not quite as enthusiastic as you had been previously, is that right? Yes, I would put it a little more strongly than that, and a little less strongly than revulsion. Very well. What was the reason why Pearl Harbor had any bearing on your attitude towards the Communist Party? I think I should add something to that. It says here, that is, I didn't like to continue a clandestine operation of any kind at a time when I saw myself with the possibility or prospect of getting more deeply involved in the war. There was no question in your mind that this was a clandestine operation, was there? I don't think I concealed it from friends, but I didn't advertise it. You didn't conceal it from your communist friends, certainly. Or my wife, or so on. What effect did the Nazi-Russian Pact of 1939 have on your attitude towards the Communist Party? I hated the sudden switch that they made. I hoped that they would realize that this was a mistake. I didn't understand that the communists in this country were not free to think, that the line was completely dictated from abroad. You didn't cease your contributions at that time, did you? Contributions to this affair? Yes. I don't think it had any effect. Pardon? I don't think it had any effect. Doctor, coming to page 9 of your answer, you refer to your brother Frank. He told you in 1937, probably in 1937, that he and his wife Jackie had joined the Communist Party. What was the occasion for telling you that? My memory is sharp, but it could be wrong. I think he drove up to Berkeley, spent the night with me, and told me about it then. What was the reason for telling you? Do you know? Did he explain why he was telling you? I was his brother, I suppose, and something of the fraternal relations was involved. Did he ask your advice about it? Oh, Lord, no. He had taken the step. Was it shocking to you? My recollection, which may not be the same as his, is that I was quite upset about it. You say in the autumn of 1941 they, meaning your brother and his wife, came to Berkeley. They moved to Berkeley. I'm reading your answer. Yes. And Frank worked for the radiation laboratory. At the time, he made it clear to me that he was no longer a member of the Communist Party. How did he make it clear to you? By saying so, I think. Just that? It was presumably in a context. I don't remember the context. You mean he just said, I'm no longer a member? He probably said that he had not been since he left Stanford, which was some time earlier. No, I don't think he did. I don't think he did because the Stanford thing I was not clear about. Did you talk with him about his left-wing friends, either then or later? I may have. Why do you say you may have? I don't recollect it. I may be wrong about this conversation with Frank, and it may be that I asked him. Did he have any party connections? Why would you have asked him? Ernest Lawrence had told me he would like to take Frank on. This was not secret work, but it was in the radiation lab. Lawrence had a very strong objection to political activity and to left-wing activity. When Lawrence had talked to me about it, he said, provided your brother behaves himself or some such, and keeps out of these things, it would have been natural for me to inquire. You knew that if it were known that your brother was a member of the Communist Party, he could not get the job, didn't you? Yes, my honor was a little bit involved because of my having talked to Lawrence. Did you know, or did you believe, that if it were known that your brother was a very recent member of the Communist Party, he might not get the job? I didn't know, and I don't know, what effect that would have had. Did you inquire? No. Did you tell Lawrence that your brother had been a member of the party? I think I told him he had a lot of left-wing activity. Did you tell him he had been a member of the Communist Party? I don't think so. Your honor didn't require you to do that? I didn't think so. You should have, shouldn't you? These things were not that way in those days, at least not in the community that I knew. It wasn't regarded, perhaps foolishly, as a great state crime to be a member of the Communist Party, or as a matter of dishonor or shame. Now, continuing with your answer on page 9, quote, as to the alleged activities of Jackie and Frank in 1944, 45, and 46. I was not in Berkeley in 1944 and 45. I was away most of the first half of 1946. I do not know whether these activities occurred or not, and if I had any knowledge of them at the time, it would only have been very sketchy. Doctor, may I ask you, sir, you say if you had any knowledge, did you have any knowledge of them? If I had known whether I had knowledge, I would have said so in here. I can't remember. You don't know whether you did or not. That's right. I can't remember whether Frank referred to these things or not. I had no knowledge in the sense of a detailed or clear discussion, and I didn't think it right to say that he couldn't have mentioned these lectures or something like that. Referring to your New Year's Day visit to Frank at his house, you were at Frank's house on New Year's Day in 1946? I was. I believe that later in the day we went out to a reception, but this is my brother's recollection. Do you recall seeing Pinsky and Adelson there that day? I certainly don't. I have written it here as is true. Do you recall that Mrs. Oppenheimer, I mean your wife, was ill that day? I remember something which is not very clear. No, I don't recall. I thought maybe the evening before we had come home early from New Year's Eve because she was not feeling well. Where were you staying at that particular time? The whole of our family was staying with the whole of my brother's family. We had not seen each other for a long time, and we stayed in Berkeley. But you were not staying in the but you were not staying in the same house as your brother was in, were you? We were in sort of a barn. That is correct. Don't you recall that Mrs. Oppenheimer was not feeling good and she stayed in the barn, and you went over to your brother's house and talked to Adelson and Pinsky? I don't recollect it, no. I have no recollection of my wife's illness. You say, quote, Pinsky and Adelson, who were at most casual acquaintances of mine. How had you made their acquaintance, casual or otherwise? Adelson I met, I believe, for the first time in his house. No, in the house of a friend, or in his house, I am not clear. That was many, many years earlier. They were thinking of starting this union at Shell, and they asked me to talk about how the teachers' union had been. I believe. Oh yeah, sorry, he keeps going. I believe he had to do with the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists, and Technicians. What was Adelson's work, as far as you know? He was at the Shell Development Company, as a scientist of some kind. Both Pinsky and Adelson you knew to be communist sympathizers, if not members. I didn't know them to be members, and I had so little contact with them at the statement that they were communist sympathizers goes beyond what I know. Do you know a man named Barney Young? Young? Yes. I don't recollect. What did you see of Pinsky and Adelson subsequent to New Year's Day in 1946? I don't think I saw them. Did you hear from them? I don't remember. Or either of them. I can't deny this because it has been a rather full life, but I don't recollect it. Do you recall in March 1946 when Adelson and Pinsky or either of them suggested that you run for Congress? In March of 1946? Yes. March 1946 that I run for Congress. Suggested to Mrs. Oppenheimer. I think this suggestion I heard about. That's right. But I believe it was addressed to my brother. You are sure it was not to you? Quite sure. How did your brother hear about it? My brother told me, not Pinsky and Adelson, but that somebody had put it up to him that he should run for Congress. You have a long record of folly here, but not that I ran for Congress. I was not insinuating that you accepted the suggestion, Doctor. Doctor, you speak on page 10 of your letter of answer of the fact that your wife, quote, for a year or two during her brief marriage to Dalit, was a Communist Party member. How long was her marriage with Dalit? She will testify, and you will get from her a real biography. The impression I have is that it started in 1934 or 35, that he was killed in 1937, something like 2 or 3 years. They were separated a part of this time. It is quite a complex story, and I don't want to make it more complex by my own unfamiliarity with it. I merely wish to find out what you meant by brief marriage. Right, 2 or 3 years. At page 10 of your answer, quote, I need to make clear that this changing opinion of Russia, which was to be reinforced by the Nazi-Soviet pact and the behavior of the Soviet Union in Poland and Finland, did not mean a sharp break for me with those who held different views. At that time, I did not fully understand, as in time I came to understand, how completely the Communist Party in this country was under the control of Russia. At that time, I assume you mean 1938 or 39. No, at that time refers to this period of the Nazi-Soviet pact. I see. When did you come to understand that the Communist Party in this country was completely under the control of Soviet Russia? I would give more or less the same answer to that I gave to your question about fellow traveling, that it was a gradual process. The shift in communist position after the German attack on Russia, coming after the Nazi-Soviet pact, made a big impression. I guess during the war, thinking about it and talking to people, I got that conviction pretty deep in me. Maybe 1946? I think it was earlier than that. 1945, 44? Something like that. 1944 would be a good. Excuse me, Mr. Robb, it's 12:30. If you are about to go to some other question, I think we should now recess for lunch. Yes, I did not realize that. Yes, we will meet again at 2 o'clock. Thereupon, at 12:30 p.m., a recess was taken until 2 p.m. the same day. All right, so that's it for today's live stream. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff there. We got the direct examination, the cross-examination, the redirect examination, and the recross examination of General Groves, which was sort of mixed. Definitely not a decisive win for Oppenheimer, but not terrible either. Then Robb has just continued on his cross-examination of Oppenheimer that has lasted multiple days now, of him just going pretty much item by item through General Nichols' letter of charge and Oppenheimer's letter of response, and just sort of asking him about every single thing in there. And Oppenheimer just consistently being like, well, not really, I don't know, stuff like that. Um, but yeah, definitely interesting stuff. Um, so that's as far as I'm gonna go today for sure. But yeah, I think that was interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say about what I read today, just that, it's more interesting stuff in history. I am also very pleased that I was able to find the transcripts of the isotopes hearing online. At some point, I want to do a live stream of that too, because it's just, funny, classic Oppenheimer. I like that. Um, and I'm glad I found this book by Ray Monk in my school library. Um, that was I think it was funny, the account by some other physicist that like Oppenheimer was very like trying to be funny, and like he wanted other people to think he was funny, and like he would look around after he made some witty remark to make sure it landed well. Just definitely paints a very like vivid picture of who he was, uh, and like his personality and stuff. And I like those kind of biographical details. I find those interesting. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Um, I may or may not live stream next weekend. I on the books, I am supposed to go to a rocket launch in the Austin area, but unfortunately, there is a burn ban in effect due to the drought here in Texas, and I'm not sure that that launch will happen or not. So if the launch does happen, I will not be streaming. And if the launch does not happen, I will be streaming. So maybe I'll see you all next week. Uh, if not next week, then oh, definitely not the week after that either, because the week after that is the week of an annular eclipse in San Antonio that I'm going to see. I'm very excited about that. Um, I love eclipses. I mean, I've only been to one. Well, actually, that's not fair. If we're just talking about eclipses, I've been to many because there's lunar eclipses all the time, and those are a lot easier to see than the solar eclipses. But I went to the 2017 solar eclipse in South Carolina, and that was incredible. And I'm excited to see this annular eclipse. It'll be definitely different than a total eclipse because uh, the photosphere of the sun will not be entirely blocked out by the moon, and so it'll be brighter, but the sun will basically look like a ring, or annulus in Latin, which is where you get the word. And I'm excited to see that. And I will, I think, be either streaming or making a YouTube video about that annular eclipse. I'm still deciding what I'll do, but definitely going to make some content about the annular eclipse and my experience going to the eclipse in San Antonio, but I will not be streaming that weekend. I will not be streaming Oppenheimer stuff that weekend. So that's October 14th. So if I don't see you all next weekend, then I'll see you all in 3 weeks. So we might have a little break from Oppenheimer hearings for a little while, but you know, I'm enjoying it. I love learning about history, and I am having fun learning about Oppenheimer and the development of the atomic bomb. So thank you all for watching, and I will